Moving further with theoretical framework, we would like to address as how theory is generated. We have already discussed it earlier that the theoretical framework is the foundation on which the entire deductive research is based upon. It is a logically developed, described, and elaborated network of association among the variables that are considered relevant to the problem situation. And please remember that it is identified through processes like interviews, observations, and literature review, of course. It becomes very evident at this stage that to arrive at a good solution to the problem, we should first correctly identify the problem and then, of course, the variables that contribute to it. The importance or significance of doing a very thorough and detailed literature review and conducting exploratory and inductive research now becomes very clearer to us. And after identifying the appropriate variables, the next step is to elaborate the network of association among the variables. Why? Because we would like to have the relevant hypotheses that can be developed and subsequently they can be tested. And based on the results of the hypothesis testing, which may indicate whether or not the hypotheses have been supported or rejected, the extent to which the problem can be solved therefore becomes more clearer. Hence, the theoretical framework is the most important step in the research process. I would like to add that the relationship between the literature review and the theoretical framework is that the literature review provides the solid foundation for developing the theoretical framework. And the literature review identifies the variables that might be important as determined by previous studies or by previous research findings. In addition, what we see is that there are other logical connections that can be conceptualized and it can basically form the basis for the theoretical model. So keep in mind that the theoretical framework represents and elaborates the relationship among the variables. It explains the theory underlining these relations, and again, it describes the nature and direction of the relationship. So just as the literature review sets the stage for a good theoretical framework, this in turn provides the logical basis for developing testable hypotheses. Now, what are the components of a theoretical framework? As I've discussed earlier, that a good theoretical framework identifies and defines the important variables in the situation that are relevant not only to the problem, but they can subsequently describe and explain the interconnections among the variables. I generally advise my students at all levels that a good theoretical framework is not necessarily a complex framework. It can be very simple and it can be very straightforward. But what we really need to keep in mind is that there are three basic features that should be incorporated in any theoretical framework. Number one, the variables considered relevant to the study should be clearly defined. Number two, the conceptual model that describes the relationships between the variables in the model should be given. And number three is that there should be a clear explanation of why we expect these relationships to exist. I do agree that it is not always easy to come up with generally agreed upon definitions of the relevant variables. In fact, there are many definitions available in the literature for different variables. For instance, there are literally numbers of definitions, for customer satisfaction, for service quality, for brand image, even for motivation. But still, a well-selected guiding definition of the concept is always important and required. Why? Because it would help you to provide an explanation for the relationships between the variables that are there in your model. What's more is that they will also serve as a basis for the operationalization or measurement of your concepts in the data collection stage of your overall research process. Therefore, we will have to be very clear in terms of adopting or adapting the definition from the literature. Please remember that do not use dictionary definitions, they are usually too general. So it is also important that we explain why we have chosen a particular definition as our guiding definition. The other question is that a conceptual model helps us to structure our discussion of the literature. A conceptual model describes our ideas about how the concepts, again, when I say concepts, I'm referring to variables in our model, are related to each other. So, a semantic diagram of the conceptual model helps the readers to visualize the theorized relationship between the variable in our model, and thus to obtain a quick idea and how you think that management problems can be solved. Therefore, the conceptual models are often expressed in these forms. Nevertheless, relationship between variables can also be adequately expressed in words, and both a semantic diagram of the conceptual model and a description of the relationship between the variables in words should be provided in our research, so that the reader can not only see but can easily comprehend our model that we are presenting. And that's one of the reasons why it is very important that our model is based on a very sound theory. Again, a theory or a clear explanation for the relationship in our model is the last component of theoretical framework. What theory does is that theory tries to explain relationships between the variables that are there in our model. It's more of an explanation, which should be provided for all the important relationships that are theorized to exist among the variables. If the nature and direction of the relationships can be theorized on the basis of the findings of previous research and or on your own ideas of the subject, then there should be an indication as to whether relationship should be positive or it should be negative or it should be linear or non-linear. So from the theoretical framework, then the testable hypothesis can be developed in order to examine whether the theory formulated is valid or not. What we need to keep in mind is that we do not necessarily have to invent a new theory every time we are trying to go for any research project. In applied research context, you may apply existing theories to specific context. What it means is that the arguments can be drawn from previous research. However, in basic research context, we will make some contribution to the existing theories and models. And in such cases, as I said earlier, it is not always possible to use existing theories or explanations for the relationships between the variables. So what we see as a result is that we will have to rely on our own insights and ideas, which of course are drawn from the literature and the past or the previous studies.